Welcome to Identifying and Supporting Students with Language Disorder. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Quinn, speech pathologist and Head of Therapy Services at the Glenleighden School.
And I'm Raelee. I'm an educator and discipline leader with SALDA School Support Services. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today. It's aimed at developing your ability to identify and support the 1 in 14 children who have developmental language disorder.
Just a quick introduction into the organisation that we represent, Speech and Language Development Australia. There are a number of branches to our company. We have the School Support Services, to which Raelee belongs, which is a multidisciplinary team who provide consultative services to schools across Queensland. Whilst another branch of our organisation is education, which encompasses the Glenleighden School. Glenleighden is a prep to Year 12 specialist school in the leafy suburb of Fig Tree Pocket here in Brisbane that supports students who have language disorder as their primary difficulty. Another branch of our organisation is the Professional Learning Service. This includes our webinar series and also our online learning modules, the first 4 of which are freely available on the SALDA website. We also have a Facebook page for educational professionals that we'll link you to at the end of today's webinar. The objectives of today's presentation is to outline some key background information about the components of oral language, so that we'll all have a shared knowledge about key terminology before we speak specifically about the profile of children whose language difficulties are the result of developmental language disorder. Raelee will then be addressing specifically strategies that can be applied in the classroom to support children with this hidden yet common developmental disorder. Professor Gina Compte-Ramsey, a British professor and specialist in language disorders, reminds us of the importance of language to us all, stating that from infancy, language is integral to just about everything we do: share, understand, perceive, and achieve. Let's begin by addressing the key but often confused terminology of speech and language. You'll frequently hear speech and language associated with speech pathology. Speech and language are quite often confused, but they're actually 2 distinctly different areas. When I'm talking about speech, I'm referring to the sounds that we make when we're talking, like the p, the, k, and d. Children with speech sound delays and disorders can find it difficult to produce the sounds within words, which can make them difficult to understand. On the other hand, language relates more to the words that we use. How we select them to convey our meaning, how we put these words together, how we understand them, and how we use words in a structured and conventional way. Put simply, language is the information that is shared between people, and speech is one of the ways that language and information is shared. Some other ways of sharing information are writing and signing. The focus of today's presentation is on language, but it's important to know the difference of the terminology of speech versus language, as many of the students that we'll be talking about today who present with developmental language disorder can often, but not always, present with speech sound errors, which may impact on their speech clarity or their intelligibility. Now, language is a very broad topic, so we'll break it down further into some specific areas. When we talk about oral language, we differentiate between expressive and receptive language. I like to think about oral language as the ultimate present. When we share the present, or our thoughts, plans, comments, jokes, questions, or ideals, we are using our expressive language as we convey our message. In short, we are expressing ourselves. While receptive language is the ability to unwrap the present, to understand those shared ideas, comments, questions, instructions, or a joke that have been given to us by our communication partner. So now that we know that language can be categorised into expressive and receptive domains, or the giving or receiving of oral language, we can then delve a little deeper into the components of language. In the late 1970s, Bloom and Lay proposed a nice and succinct model which has stood the test of time, in which the areas of language are broken into three broad components of form, content, and use. Unfortunately, we don't have time today to go into all of these areas in really great detail, so I'm going to give you an executive summary of each of these areas for you to consider when thinking about a child for whom you have concerns regarding their language development, and how difficulties with form, content and use may present in your classroom. If you'd like to know more about each aspect of language, you'll find more detail in the handout provided with this webinar entitled The Components of Language. The first component of language we're going to talk about today is content or semantics. Semantics is the part of our language that holds meaning. This includes the knowledge of word meanings as well as the complex links between related words. I like to visualise the semantic system as a mental filing cabinet that contains a student's entire vocabulary. In this filing cabinet, for each word, there is a definition, information about how that word is pronounced, as well as links to other words that are related to it, such as synonyms or antonyms. For some students with semantic skill difficulties, these files may not be filled out entirely, or they might be missing information. For others, the files might be out of order, or in the filing cabinet may have been upended completely. Expressively, these difficulties with content aspects of language impact on the student's ability to find a word quickly to convey their meaning. Or it may mean that they have difficulties comprehending a word in a dynamic exchange that is a classroom instruction or a conversation. Students with DLD may take a long time to retrieve a word that they want to use, often using interjections or fillers such as or are, or they might pull out the wrong word, like saying dishwasher when they really meant washing machine. For these students, that is students with developmental language disorder, it means that learning a new word is often a challenge and could take significantly more practice and exposures to new words before they're able to use them correctly. In fact, with researchers telling us that typically developing children will need approximately 7 exposures to learn a new word, whilst children with DLD will need about 40. The next component of language that we'll be discussing is form, which encompasses word order, word endings, speech and sound knowledge. The language areas that relate to form of language include syntax, morphology and phonology, and we're going to discuss each of these in a little more detail. Syntax refers to the arrangement of words or phrases or a sentence to indicate meaning. For example, here we have the sentence, James is chasing Sarah. But if I use those same 4 words, of James is chasing and Sarah, but I change the word order, okay, to Sarah is chasing James, the sentence tells us something entirely different. Students with difficulties in the area of syntax might produce short or simple sentences or sentence fragments rather than complex sentences. For example, instead of saying, the hungry bird ate the worm, a student with language disorder might simplify it and say, the bird ate the worm. Or more simply, just birdie. Or those with severe syntactic challenges may say it in the incorrect order with bird, worm, ate. Another element of the form of language is morphology, or the small grammatical structures in words. It essentially refers to anything that you add on to the root word. For example, you might have plurals, or tenses, or suffixes, to name a few. Students with language disorder and difficulties in the area of morphology might omit these structures entirely. For example, saying hat instead of hats, or smile instead of smiling. You probably frequently hear the word phonology in the school setting, but might not be aware of how it applies to language. Phonology refers to the knowledge of the sound system of language. This has particular applications to the speech sound production, as well as to the literacy skills of our students. Talking about speech first. Phonological errors are a type of speech sound error in which the students make errors within the patterns or groups of sounds, due to the way that the sounds are represented in their language system. It can be quite surprising to some people to find out that some students' speech difficulties actually have their roots in the area of language. Another aspect of phonology is phonological awareness, which is an essential foundational skill to early literacy. Phonological awareness is a group of skills that, as the name suggests, are the awareness of sounds. These skills include identifying syllables, rhyming, alliteration, blending, segmenting. You might have heard of phonemic awareness, which is a subset of a broader range of phonological awareness skills, and simply refers to those skills relating to the individual sounds in words, like blending and segmenting. Basically, phonological awareness is an umbrella term for a group of skills that allow students to identify and to play with sounds. So now we've covered the content and the form. The final aspect of language is use. Essentially, how students use their language in various situations. This includes the reasons and the purposes for which we communicate. The word we use for this is often called pragmatics. Pragmatic skills include conversational skills such as initiating a conversation, taking turns in a conversation, maintaining that topic, asking questions of the other person, as well as ending the conversation appropriately. A developmental language disorder now. Now that you have a framework to reflect on regarding the expressive and receptive components of oral language, let's turn to discussing developmental language disorder specifically. Developmental language disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterised by ongoing language difficulties that cannot be explained by another condition such as autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, or hearing impairment, and which exists despite the adequate language learning opportunities. DLD is a developmental disability that affects how children think about, understand, and use language. As discussed, these children with developmental language disorder have difficulties with oral language. This may be difficulties with their talking or with their understanding, and frequently both. No two students with language disorder will present the same way. They will each have their own unique challenges and strengths. However, there are a few common signs of language disorder to look out for if you have concerns amongst your students. Children with DLD often use shorter sentences and may have difficulty using a range of vocabulary or when learning new words. They may also have challenges with understanding oral language, such as following classroom directions, as well as comprehending questions. This disorder can be mild, moderate, or severe. However, it's really worth noting that even mild difficulties will have an impact on the child's day-to-day activities, both at school and at home. DLD is often referred to as a hidden yet common disorder, as prevalence studies show us that approximately 1 in 14 students has a developmental language disorder, which equates to approximately 2 children in every classroom. Now that we have a framework to reflect on regarding the expressive and receptive components of oral language, let's turn to discussing developmental language disorder. Sorry, I missed that. Sorry. As discussed, children with developmental language disorder.
Oh, you must have those slides twice.
Yeah. Sorry, let's go on. So what is developmental language disorder? Unfortunately, as yet, DLD, the causes of DLD are not yet known. Although it appears that it may run in families, particularly if there's a family history of language difficulties or dyslexia, it's definitely much more common in boys, with boys being approximately 4 times more likely than girls to have DLD. Challenging behaviour also often co-occurs with DLD, as the challenges that these children have with expressing their thoughts and sharing their ideas can result in understandable frustration. Difficulties with understanding classroom discussions, conversations, and instructions can also be misinterpreted as poor inattention or poor listening. Children with DLD are at high risk of poor mental health, and unfortunately incarceration and poor employment opportunities. As the wider community does not know what DLD is, and sometimes even that it exists, this can increase the burden on families who are supporting a child with DLD. The term developmental language disorder is a relatively new diagnostic term, proposed and adopted by an international group of experts across the speech pathology, education and psychology professions in 2017. Prior to this, unfortunately, there were a number of terms used and various criteria adopted when describing childhood language impairments, such as language delay, childhood aphasia, language learning difficulties, with the most commonly used term being specific language impairment, or SLI. To confuse things even further, unfortunately, this same acronym of SLI is used in some states, including Queensland, for a targeted funding category through the Educational Adjustment Program. In this context, SLI is used to relate to a different term, which is speech and language impairment. However, it's important to note that not all students with developmental language disorder will qualify for this funding category due to the restrictive eligibility thresholds. Currently, only students with severe or profound developmental language disorders meet the criteria for SLI, whilst many, if not all students with DLD will benefit and require adjustments to support their learning in the classroom, which we'll be going through in more detail shortly. Early intervention. Difficulties with language will likely to have a wide-ranging impacts on the child with DLD's ability to learn at school. Their literacy acquisition, emotional well-being, and their ability to develop and maintain friendships. Therefore, early intervention, diagnosis and support is really key to improving the outcomes of children with DLD. Early childhood educators, such as yourselves, play a crucial role in the early identification and onward referral of children with language concerns. Rather than adopting a wait-and-see approach, taking the opportunity to act and seek early intervention for these children is crucial. With longitudinal studies showing us that children with language difficulties at age 5 are likely to continue to have significant problems throughout their schooling. Therefore, early intervention in the preschool years particularly is paramount. Developmental norms. Now, I know that I don't need to talk to you all about developmental norms, as you as early educators see language develop around you every day in your students. But I just wanted to share with you 2 high-quality resources that you might find useful when discussing your concerns with parents. Speech Pathology Australia has developed the Communication Milestones Kit, which includes a posters that outline speech and language milestones for children between 1 and 5 years that wouldn't look out of place in any early childhood setting. And they also have information sheets such as this one I've pulled out here that can be useful for starting conversations with families about their child, your concerns with regards to their speech, language and communication. So here you can see an example of what they provide for the 4-year-olds. I also really like the federal government's Raising Children's website that provides detailed information about language development from infancy through to middle childhood, as well as some practical ideas for parents to support their child's language. Early intervention, diagnosis and support is key to improving the outcomes of children with DLD. Therefore, I'd encourage you to discuss your concerns with families and to support them to make referrals when needed. Referrals to speech pathologists can be made to local community health centres. Typically they need a GP referral, or directly by parents to private speech pathology services. Now, if you'll bear with us for a moment, cross your fingers that we can get this to work, but we're just wanting to share with you a video which is developed by the Raddle advocacy campaign. Raddle is an international group aimed at raising awareness of students with DLD, and they have some great videos that can be shared that share the voices of children and young adults with developmental language disorder. Let's see how we go.
Hi, I'm Eddie. And I'm Dooms. We're here to tell about DLD, Developmental Language Disorder. Let's go, hurry up. Come on, we don't have all day. Today we're going to find out about DLD and explain 3 things what you have to know. DLD 1, 2, 3. We're going to interview some people, but we can't find them anywhere. Oh, found you! Have you heard of DLD? Developmental Language Disorder. It's when you have difficulties talking and understanding words. Who has DLD? It affects children and adults. Has it always been called DLD? It's been called lots of things like SLI, but now it's been agreed being called DLD. What's DLD like? It's just like speaking a different language. You're not even oblivious of what they're saying to you. You just want them to speak English, not those big words, because it's just making it way more harder. You really want to say something and it just stops. Your brain is just gone, is that the word? No, it's not. Is it this one? No, it's not. It's picking out loads of different things. I just want it to teleport to the other person's head so they know what it means and they get what I'm trying to say to them as quickly as I can. So there you are, Dils. DLD is when children or adults have problems with talking or understanding. Well, that's really interesting, Eddie. I'm going to try and find out some more. Why do we need to know about DLD?
It's very important that we know about DLD because it's very common, but it's very hidden. And a lot of people don't realise that. It affects about 2 children in every classroom, which is really surprising.
So why does it matter?
It is important because it affects reading, writing, learning, joining in with things, and of course self-esteem. We weren't aware our child had DLD because it was hidden. Even though it's common, it's hidden, and we weren't understanding that he had difficulties at school with his learning, his understanding, which all affected his self-esteem.
So there you go, Eddie. It's really common and it's hidden. It can make lots of things hard, like school and reading. It can be hard joining in and feeling good about yourself. I see, then. Let's see if there's any help. What help is out there?
There's all sorts of help. I was helped by speech language therapists, teachers and other professionals. My parents helped me, and in fact all sorts of people can help you, your colleagues and your friends too.
How can they help?
It really makes a difference if people can understand about DLD. It's hard for me to explain what DLD means, but when people do understand, it makes a big difference.
So Dylan, there is help, and everybody can help by knowing about DLD. So remember, DLD 1, 2, 3. Please share our film. Thank you for watching.
So that's one of my favourite videos, but there's actually quite a range of videos from different ages and from different perspectives, be it the children's perspectives or the perspectives of the parents. And so they can be really worth tapping into it to build your knowledge with regards to developmental language disorder. Now I'll hand over to Raelee.
Thanks, Lisa. Before we get into the strategies, I think it's important to set the scene for the role of the educator. We are fortunate to live in a time and a country where we have disability standards for education that stipulate that we need to provide reasonable adjustments for students with a disability or suspicion of a disability. This includes consulting the student or their associate about the design or implementation of adjustments. Many of today's classroom strategies for students with developmental language disorder can actually be included as adjustments and documented as such. But they're not just strategies, they are often what the child or the student will require to access the curriculum or communicate with the people in their surroundings. In the early years, children's language is typically developed by listening to their parents, their carers, siblings, teachers, and other members of the community. Children with developmental language disorder will require specialist intervention, as Lisa was just discussing. However, there are several ways that the language development can be supported and stimulated in early childhood environments. Many of these strategies will benefit both typically developing children and those with developmental language disorder. Intuitively, early educators are good at developing oral language. Supporting oral language begins by spending time talking with your students through engaging in imaginative play, playing games, reading books, introducing your class to nursery rhymes or songs, everything that we would generally see in an early years classroom. It doesn't matter if you don't play the game properly or if you make up your own rules or miss some of the words on a page when reading a book. What really matters is that you're talking about these things and you're discussing the characters in the story, who they are, what they are doing and why they do the things that they're doing. Teachers really need to consider their role in supporting language and communication. Did you know that 7% of meaning is communicated through the spoken word? 7%, like that's a startling number. The rest of language is communicated by 38% through the tone of voice and 55% just through body language. So as teachers, we need to consider our own oral language when delivering messages. We need to consider that the rate, making sure it's not too fast, or our volume, so it's not too soft. Our intonation can hook students' interests or emphasise particular parts. Again, I often see this in early years classrooms. But finally, your general intelligibility is important. So check pronunciations of key vocabulary and consider supplementing with visual aids if necessary. Let's also consider some barriers to the students listening. If you're facing away from the student, it may be difficult for them to hear you. This sometimes happens when teachers are reading books out loud and they're covered by the book, or when they're facing the board while talking. Also, writing and talking and demonstrating simultaneously can be a challenge. If there are too many points or jokes that students don't understand or have double meanings, but also when there is too much talking and the students are expected to be inactive or listen for long periods of time. You all know that you've got those wigglers and wanderers. Facilitating communication requires consideration and planning. The very first thing you need is to build a rapport, and often that might need to be strategic. Dr. Kevin Perry's research in 2016 supports these findings. His work found that students actually believe the number one reason for them to have improved learning outcomes is through the relationship they have with their teacher. By the way, the number two reason is the teacher's understanding and awareness of student relationships. So you can see developing a student relationship is crucial. I find early years teachers do this intuitively, but if it has become a challenge, find common interests or invent some. Look for things that the student is interested in or that they like and make comment on it. For example, oh, I see you're wearing a Batman shirt. I like Batman too. Now, this can be a little bit harder if the students are less communicative. If this is the case, you might like to try parallel playing next to them and reduce your language and the volume. So, for example, imagine a Play-Doh table. Go and sit next to the student very quietly and just make simple one-word comments. The Play-Doh might be yellow, so you might go, yellow, or squishy, ooh, soft. And then eventually make something and hide it under your hand and then lean in for a whisper, soft voice saying, guess what's under my hand? Another idea is to use sabotage. It's a great strategy. What you can do is put the child's favourite toy inside a container and make sure that the lid is very difficult to open. That way they'll need to bring it to you to ask for help. Some more proactive strategies to facilitate communication include careful wording of questions, visual aids, and bringing student insights to them to develop their ideas further. We're going to take a closer look at these now. Following the students' leads and joining in with the activities that they are interested in promotes participation and interaction. To do this, adults will need to loosen their agenda and focus on observing and listening to the students' interests and responding to them. Multisensory play and language-based activities combining the students' interests will support this. Some of you may remember a resource from 2007 called the Prep Talk Project. This was developed by two speeches, Jenny Matthews and Catriona Pine. They use the 3 C's, which can be used during these multisensory language-based activity times. So there is crouching, which is where you crouch down to the student's level. You comment, for example, oh, I wonder, I see. Or you can count silently to yourself to allow the student time to talk. And you could expect to wait for a minimum of 10 seconds for a response. So count silently to 10 to yourself, allowing them that opportunity. Here's some other comments that you could use in the in your early years environment. Things like, I wonder how they are feeling, or I wonder if it will work. I wonder what else I will need. I'm sure you can think of many times throughout your day when you've used comments like this. Expanding and extending students' utterances exposes them to more complex language. When expanding a student's language, the adult models the sentence in a more mature form. For example, the student might say, "Car, go." The teacher can say, "The car is going." When extending, the adult repeats the sentence in a more mature form without changing the intention of the student's communication. For example, the student might say, "Train, uh-oh." So the teacher can respond with, "Train broken, uh-oh, the train is broken." In this dialogue, the student is commenting, so the teacher expands and extends the student's comment. Modelling allows students to hear correct examples of a range of language structures in context. So, for example, if a student said, "Him fell down the stairs," then the teacher can say, "Yes, he fell down the stairs." Students with developmental language disorder will benefit from additional opportunities to communicate throughout their day, to comment, to request, to greet, to respond, to refuse, or initiate conversation. In the context of a busy and dynamic classroom with peers who may be inclined to answer for the student, explicitly setting up these opportunities or communication temptations might be necessary. Communication temptations provide these students with a purpose to communicate. These type of these temptations may include giving the student part of a toy to provide an opportunity to request for the other part, or doing something unusual or unexpected to encourage a comment from them. Communication temptations provide motivating opportunities for students to express their needs and wants. Students with language disorder may communicate non-verbally by using body language, gestures, pointing, shaking their head, or using facial expressions. Remember that percent I was talking about before? 55% of communication is through body language. So hopefully, sometimes they might be combined with some words or sound or word attempts. But during this time, this is when the teacher's priority should be to observe those non-verbal communications and support the student in what they're wanting to communicate rather than how they are communicating it. Once a communication temptation is provided, the primary focus of the adult is to wait, allowing the student the opportunity to initiate communication. This might feel uncomfortable initially. It does. The teacher does not need to give any cues, facial expressions or gestures, which I think can be hard for early years teachers, but rather you wait and allow the student to initiate the communication through gesture or facial expression, making noises or word attempts. So it's important to be an observer and look for those non-verbal clues. Communication temptations can be easily integrated into daily routines. For example, when it comes time to line up for play break, a teacher might put a student's hat in an obvious yet out of reach position and wait. You're waiting for the student to look at you as a teacher and then waiting for more communication, such as pointing at the hat, vocalising or attempting to say the word. The teacher can repeat what the student has said, imitate, interpret or add a word. So for example, a student would come to the teacher and tug at their clothing or their hand, and the teacher would give them eye contact and wait expectantly. Then the student would point to the hat at the top of the shelf, but the teacher waits. The student might make sounds, attempting to say hat. And the teacher would say, hat, get hat. At this point, I'd also like to touch on some strategies to support students answering questions. Throughout the course of the day, students get asked many questions. A student with developmental language disorder will find answering questions a challenge. Some simple strategies to use when this happens are to simplify the question, prompt for an answer, or offer a choice. We can simplify a question for a child by changing the language that we use to ask the question. So instead of saying, "Can you get the dictionary and give it to Ben?" you could say, "Can you get the blue book that's on the table and give it to Ben?" We can also simplify an instruction or question by breaking down the steps involved. So you could say, "Get the blue book on the table. Now give the blue book to Ben." You can also ask the child to repeat the instruction back to you, just to make sure they know what they need to do. So you could say, "What are you going to get?" "That's right, the blue book." "And who are you going to give it to?" "Yes, Ben." But the most simple strategy you can use is just to repeat the instruction, because maybe the child only caught part of the question or the instruction the first time. Using prompts are also helpful in supporting children if they aren't able to answer questions. For example, you could give a prompt by giving them the start of a sentence. "He is crying because he..." You could provide the first sound of the target word. So if the student was talking about Sam, you could say, "His name is..." Using actions or gestures like opening your arms wide for big, or "Get me your hat," and pointing to your head. You can also prompt for more information when a child is talking, just by simply going, "Oh really? And?" So that you're not putting words in their mouth, but you're simply waiting for a response. Finally, offering a choice of two options can greatly reduce the complexity of a response. For example, you might ask, "Where did you go today?" If the student is unable to answer, then offer a choice. "Did you go to the beach or did you go to the park?" When students are answering or responding to questions, you may have experienced an inappropriate response because they did not understand the concept of the WH word. For example, you may have asked, "Who did you spend the weekend with?" And the student will answer, "At home." So what they're doing is they're answering a who question with a what response. So using visuals like these slides and explicitly teaching through examples, this will support students with developmental language disorder. Also, directing students to the information that is required in an answer can greatly improve their success. They will also need a lot of practice, so where possible, avoid asking yes or no questions. I'd like to talk to you now about the prompt hierarchy. The hierarchy of prompting is used to support students to become more independent in completing a skill. Prompting is any action taken to provide support to the learner to complete a task successfully. Prompts should only be used to support learners when necessary and only for as long as necessary. I think that's the really important message for staff working in schools. Too often, supports are put in place and they're never faded as the student develops learned helplessness. I'm sure you can all think of students like this. Conversely, some students are left to fail as they're given little to no prompts. The prompt hierarchy provides a structured way to fade out prompts or ensure that the necessary level of prompting is used. The bottom of the prompt hierarchy is the most independent level. In other words, no prompts at all. The remaining levels are sequenced from the least amount of help to the most amount of help. Prompting can either be used from least to most or most to least, as described in this model. And you know what? We're going to include a prompt hierarchy handout for you to access, because it's a great framework to use with staff in schools to plan and reflect about the type of support that's required for a particular student. Always keeping in mind that the end game is the student's independence. There is essentially two sequences of prompting, as I was just saying, least to most, most to least. So I'm going to talk through most to least. In this use of the prompt hierarchy, the adult starts with the most amount of prompting and then fades this out as the student is successful. This is different from the least to most prompting order because the adult provides the prompt before the learner responds rather than correcting them after the mistake. This is the most effective for students who currently lack the skills necessary to complete a task. So the example I'm going to use is Ben is having difficulty following a direction of putting your hat away and sitting on the carpet. Who hasn't seen that in their classroom? So let's start with the full model. This is where the adult models putting the hat into the student's desk and sitting on the carpet. The adult might use this same instruction multiple times over multiple days before moving on to the partial model. With the partial model, the adult puts the hat in Ben's hand, opens the desk, and then puts it inside. After Ben puts the hat away, the adult closes the desk, takes his hand, walks him to the carpet, and uses the gesture of sitting as a visual support. Again, this instruction or type of support might go for multiple days before moving on to a direct prompt. The direct prompt is where the adult states, put your hat in your desk. And after this is done, the adult says, come to the carpet and sit. Again, the adult might use this for multiple days before the student doesn't require a direct prompt anymore. So then you could use the indirect prompt. And this is where the adult says, what do you need to put back in your desk? And then, where do you need to go now? And hopefully, with those indirect prompts, it won't be long until the student will be doing it independently, requiring no prompts at all. This next example is from least to most. It is moving up the prompt ladder from the bottom. This order is most appropriate for learners who have the prerequisite or the foundational skills necessary, but are not performing them independently. In this approach, the adult gives the student the task and provides no prompting from the bottom level of the ladder. If the student responds incorrectly, only then does the adult provide the next level prompt. If the student is still incorrect with that level of support, then the adult moves up to the more supportive prompt level. So the example I'm going to use is John, who can show that he can share, but he struggles to play trains together with other students. Who hasn't seen that in their classroom? So you would start with the indirect verbal prompt. John, it looks like Max wants to play trains too. Then you would move into the direct verbal prompt. John, give Max some train track pieces, please. Oh, sorry, we would use, John, give Max some train track pieces, thank you. Now we're using thank you rather than please, as it sets the assumption that he will follow the direction. If he still doesn't, the next prompt to use is the direct visual prompt. So this is where the adult points to the tracks in the box and then maybe gazes over at Max. The partial model would be taking a train track piece and giving it to John and then gazing over at Max. The full model would be to take the train track piece and giving it to Max, And then the final is the hand over hand prompt. And that means you would take the train track piece, put it in John's hand, and then move his hand to give it to Max. So we've reached the end of our presentation today, and here's hoping you'll be taking home some messages that look like this. Recognising that each student with language disorder has a unique profile of strengths and weaknesses, that all students with language disorder have the potential to learn but may not learn by traditional methods. Therefore, adjustments to planning and pedagogy are essential, and also early intervention is the key. We've included some handouts to coincide with this presentation. There'll be the components of language, signs of language disorder, understanding developmental language disorder, and the hierarchy of prompts. Today we didn't go into a great deal about the use of visuals to support students with language disorder, but I can recommend a free recorded webinar on this topic, which is particularly designed for early years teachers working in the early years setting. And it's really around how to introduce visuals to students, how to decide what type of visual, and then when and how to introduce them during the school day. So you can find that on our SALDA website under the professional learning link. If you'd like to know any more information about developmental language disorder or about our school support services team, you can find us on these contacts. And we also have a closed Facebook page for educators and allied health professionals where we share strategies, resources, links, podcasts. And we often post some of our previously recorded free webinars or links to those webinars and simple videos on strategies to support students with developmental language disorder. Our closed Facebook page is SALDA/SSS Professional Network. You just need to answer some simple questions to ensure that you're an educator or an allied health professional. We'd love to see you there, so come and join us. We have no time for questions today, but we hope you enjoyed our presentation, and remember you can simply contact us if you do have any further questions.
Thanks so much. Bye.